The smarter a country's understanding of U.S. foreign policy and deeper its engagement with the U.S., the greater their likelihood of benefiting from the U.S. as a partner.
After Dr. Khan's speech, we'll have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy and proud and a little embarrassed to be here. I want to recognize Dr. Wilson, the president of the university, Dr. Archer, for his thoughtful introduction, provost of the university, General Alfonso for your interesting discussion. I also want to thank Pastor Lloyd, and of course, Dr. Mahabir Benji, as I call him, very much for putting together this wonderful program. As I was looking through the program, and also I do want to recognize distinguished speakers, Imam Sharjeel, an ambassador from Suriname, Ambassador Manorama, with whom I had a very interesting conversation over dinner. After looking through the program, I realized that I'm probably the weakest link in this program. And the pastor kind of sensed it, so he was actually praying that I say something meaningful in today's discussion. So please bear with me. What I'm trying to do is try to combine a little bit of international security with the challenges that you face. And so if you look at my first slide, which I might not be able to see. If you look at my first slide, it has a simple model of national security. I try to simplify it as much as possible. This is a model that will work for any country in the world. Basically, you have three types of security forces: external, internal, and law and order. Those you would look at police forces. The external security is your defense forces, your Air Force, your Navy, your Marines, your military, and you're essentially trying to fight off threats from foreigners, essentially, neighboring countries, etc. And I have on reliable authority that neither Jamaica nor Bahamas nor Guyana are planning to invade Trinidad anytime soon. So I think you are in this wonderful position to become like Costa Rica and not necessarily have a defense force, because you do not necessarily have external threats like other countries do. My country of origin, India, currently is paranoid about what the Chinese will do on their border. You don't have, fortunately, such a situation. As far as internal security is concerned, these are paramilitary forces where the threats come from your own citizens, people who want to secede, people who want to transform the system through rebellion or revolution. I know you have had a very traumatic experience in 1990, but to my best understanding, especially given the discussions we had in the last conference at the university, I think that threat has receded considerably. But usually when you have domestic threats where your own citizens are a threat to the national security, you need paramilitary forces. And I also have, from the same authority, that Tobago is not planning to secede anytime soon, so you don't even need domestic paramilitary forces. That leaves the last box, the law and order situation, as a crisis. And when you are dealing with law and order, you need police, you need agencies like the FBI, which are not constrained by domestic borders and limited by jurisdiction, so they can work across the country and enjoy special resources from. They usually are dealing with criminals who could be from your country, your citizens, or can be foreigners. So this is the model that I'm working with. So you look at what the threat environment is for your country, and based on that threat environment, you allocate resources and develop strategies to counter this. I read your national strategy document, which was upgraded or updated in April 2022. It's very comprehensive and interesting, but I think it focuses more on what the Ministry of National Security has to do to itself in terms of enhancing effectiveness and capabilities, rather than providing a very accurate assessment of what the security threat is, especially from crime. So I would recommend that one aspect of that national security strategy that needs to be redeveloped is an accurate assessment of the threat. I understand that there might be political reasons not to share it publicly. So I hope that the Ministry of National Security does have another document which actually articulates what the exact nature of the domestic criminal, transnational criminal, gangs, drugs-related threats really are. So the focus is essentially on the third box, law and order. And the challenge really, as I see it, is capacity building for the state. Capacity building to deal with the challenges. As I understand it, the threat perception, especially with rising crime from guns, illegal drugs, etc., has escalated so rapidly that the state capacity to confront it has not kept pace with the increasing threat. And that is partly because you are a small state. And that is a challenge. And I think that transnational crimes should be dealt in a transnational fashion, which means that not only are you shoring up state capacity, but you're also shoring up state cooperation with other states in the region. And we'll talk a little bit more after I do this small exercise of looking at this threat environment in Trinidad as I see it. I call it the drone's eye view, or I should call it the Delaware eye view, because I'm far away from the ground reality. These are the 5 challenges that I see in Trinidad. Illegal firearms traffic. This is one of your biggest problems. And I know that there have been 2 very high-profile successful operations, partly in collaboration with the US and the Interpol, where a large cache of weapons have been seized, and there have been in Trinidad too. But nevertheless, there is this threat of illegal firearms traffic, which essentially makes regular crime more deadly. And then you have a second threat of refugees, illegal migrants, which are somehow associated by transnational gangs. I'm going to step away a little bit from politically correctness and say that there's a lot of chatter, at least in your media, about the threat that comes from Venezuelan migrants and refugees in this country. I did 2 reviews, one review of the media and one review of the academic, police, security, literature. While there is a lot of talk in the media, very loose talk literally, loose talk on radio, television, in newspapers, which clearly insinuate that one of the reasons for the rise in crime is because of the crisis in Venezuela and the fact that you're only 11 kilometers. It's not as if people are just swimming across, etc. And therefore, there is this escalation. But when you look at the academic literature, it's very clear there is no evidence that there is a direct relation between this rise in immigration, both legal and not so legal, from Venezuela to Trinidad. Now, when academics say there is no connection, which means there's no study that has been done to establish that. So it is possible that there is a connection, but that hasn't been documented. That is one, perhaps, Benji, your school, your students, this is a good topic for a fast dissertation. So is there a connection? And what kind of connection are there? And let me also tell you that this is rampant across Europe, everywhere in the world. Immigrants are often the scapegoat of crime. In the United States, we have no connection between terrorism and immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers, or crime for that matter. But we have done those studies. Yes, it takes about 14 years for a refugee to become productive in the US. And until that 14th year, they are kind of a cost for the state. But after that, there is no crime. There is no escalation of crime because of increase in at least legal immigration, the refugees, etc. So you have to separate this issue. And when you are studying the connection between immigration, legal or illegal, and crime, do not neglect the fact that the immigrants themselves are often the biggest victims of the crime. There is tremendous exploitation of especially those who are undocumented. So you have to keep in mind that while some of them might be under pressure and committing petty crimes or maybe connected to transnational gangs, and transnational gangs are using this traffic of people as a way to basically send their operatives to various countries to establish safe houses and transit points for drugs, etc. While this is sure, but always keep in mind that acknowledge the crimes that are committed against the most vulnerable. Clearly, the most vulnerable members of your society are undocumented refugees who have left their homes and often maybe even linguistically challenged. And so make sure that you recognize that they are also victims, and encourage your public opinion makers that when they talk about this on television, when they talk about it in articles, opinions, to also address that they are also victims. That will make sure that there is no polarization in society, increase in hatred, because then you will start having crimes which are basically hate crimes committed by your own citizens, because they are under the illusion that the increase in crime is not because of the citizens of the host country, but because of people who are here. So that is an important aspect of it. There is a lot of chatter about it, but I think that academically the data does not stand, which means that you not only need academic studies, but you also need a lot of intelligence gathering on this issue. So it's both. You need the practitioners, the police forces, to collect intelligence on these issues. And the second thing is for academics to study about this connection. And especially academics who are public-oriented, which means that they will write a research paper published in a journal, but also write an op-ed for The Guardian locally or be on local television. I also recognize, or at least understand, that there is a rise in crime from domestic crime that you would need to acknowledge that there is a domestic crime. And in spite of the fact that the awareness has been there for more than 5-6 years, and there are efforts going on, and I will talk a little bit about the efforts that are happening, there is an increase in the crime. In spite of increased efforts to combat these crimes, illegal firearms, illegal drugs, and trafficking of people, which will be both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and just trafficking people who are trying to find new homes to live in. In all of these cases, there is an increase in all activities of crime, and therefore, I suggest that you acknowledge that there is a problem in deliverance of effective policing in Trinidad, and not just in Trinidad, but in the region. Now, it's quite possible that this capacity of your law enforcement agencies was not developed to cope with this sudden escalation of challenges, or your law enforcement agencies are not equipped to handle these new challenges. This could be a simple thing. If they don't have bulletproof jackets, they are going to be hesitant to patrol neighborhoods where they know there are guns. If they don't have intel on who might have guns. So lack of intelligence, lack of equipment can be a way of deterring the capacity of local law enforcement agencies from being more effective. But nevertheless, there has to be an acknowledgement that there hasn't been a concomitant increase in competence with the rise in challenges, even though there is a lot more resources being allocated, both domestically and internationally. And for that comes this red box. There is no visa requirements for Trinidad, so I can talk about it without the fear of my visa being canceled or something like that. I once said something like this in Singapore, and they told me on the airport that you're a persona non grata. You cannot come back to Singapore. But I think there is corruption in the firewall. And what the corruption indicates basically is there is a hole in the firewall. And so no matter how much, it's like saying that you have a pot that you're trying to fill with water and there's a hole in the pot. So the water comes in, and unless the volume of water coming out of the tap is more than the volume of water going out of the hole in the pot will never become full. And so I think you have to deal with the challenge of corruption in law enforcement. There are no studies which quantify the extent of corruption. And in some places there are, like Philippines, for example. The vice president of Philippines once told me that we over budget our projects by 20% because we know there is 20% corruption. So if a project costs $4 million, they budget something like $4.8 million, and then the project gets done and everybody is happy because they have a pretty good idea of what extent of corruption they have. But I think that corruption is an important challenge. But given the fact that there is something like CARICOM, and there is also a tremendous role of the United States in trying to combat this, I think the involvement of foreign agencies can act as a curb on domestic and local corruption. So if you're working with a partner from Bahamas on trying to track where guns are coming from, one could be corrupt, but the other may not be, and you don't know whether the other partner of yours from Bahamas or from the US or from the DEA or Jamaica is involved. So I think there needs to be a little bit more study on the corruption side of it. So I want to go back to this slide and tell you that I'm now going to focus on the red box and talk about state capacity building. And this slide. All right. This is where I'm going to do a completely illogical thing. What the illogical thing that I'm going to recommend is, it's like saying you have an alcohol problem, and I'm going to say, go seek help from an alcoholic, which is the United States. Your biggest problems, there are two killers in Trinidad. One is guns, and the other is drugs. One is heading towards the US, and the other is coming from the US. And the United States, in spite of billions of dollars available, well, trillions, we have not done a good job at home in combating either drugs or guns. We average 135 deaths per day because of gun violence in the US. And we average 300 deaths per day because of drugs. So just because we are incompetent domestically, and that is the peculiarities of US government format, our wonderful democracy, our incredible institution called the Congress, which probably is the most dysfunctional institute in the country. Because of that, we are unable to protect our own citizens either from drugs or guns. But there is a lot of research done, a lot of knowledge, a lot of state capacity, huge number of agencies. I have had lots of interactions through this program that I do on American foreign policy. We meet with DEA agents, and from the presentations we make, it's incredible the amount of knowledge they have about drug trafficking in this part of the world. It's just stunning how much intelligence they have, both accumulated as well as real time. And by real-time intelligence about gangs, about their activity, about their mobility, about the stocks, etc., it's stunning how much they have. So even though they are not able to implement some of the measures at home, perhaps you won't have those constraints. So what I'm recommending is a very serious and more enhanced cooperation with the United States on two fronts. One is state capacity building, and the other is on technology. There is an interesting deal that the United States signed with India recently called ICET, Initiative on Critical Emerging Technologies. So technologies of surveillance, the latest drone technology. To give you an idea, the drones that Turkish and Iranians sell, which became so famous in the Ukrainian war, cost around $50,000, $100,000. The drones that the US sells cost about $500 million. And the difference is on basically the capacity to gather intelligence from very high on. So there are these new emerging technologies of surveillance for national security, international security purposes, which I think can be temporarily used for domestic security purposes. But you must always keep in mind that the moment you start spying on your own citizens, you begin to compromise your democracy, you're violating their human rights. In the United States, we have the Fourth Amendment, which we'll be going straight up against. Just recently, the CIA was apologizing for flying drones over the United States. It's not supposed to spy on their own country. So you have to keep that balance right. Maybe temporary emergency powers to get the extent of gang penetration and the nature of gangs, the extent of crime that is interconnected, which gangs are operating, all of that intelligence that you need to gather. I think they're probably sitting on hard drives in the US agencies. The United States government has several projects that you are already part of, and I think you should actually, one element of your national security strategy is how to use Uncle Sam effectively. See, the United States has a grand strategy. It's in its foreign policy, and you fit in somewhere. So everything that the US is going to do to you will be a sub-goal of its grander goal. And right now the overwhelming foreign policy concern is to face the rising challenge from China. So we're not going to, while we may be engaged in the Caribbean, it is to advance our national interests, and we're not going to tinker with it based on your national interests, except that you keep pushing us and say, no, 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 this is what we need. I know you want to fly drones out of here, but what we need is this and not this. So you have to have a pretty good assessment of your threat and what you need and what you can get from Uncle Sam. For example, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, was in Bahamas on the 8th of August, or 8th of June, and she promised over $100 million. So if you look at, from at least her statement, of the $100 million, there are three items that she talked about. One is to deal with Haiti's, the humanitarian challenge. 80% of citizens of Haiti faced food shortages, so she's trying to deal with the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. She's also going to talk about health issues, dealing with the pandemic and its consequences. And 1/3 of it is specifically mentioned illegal arms and trafficking, dealing with drugs, arms, trafficking, and guns. It is as if that part of her allocation was written for you. Now, I don't know how much of it is allocated, how much, whether it's 50,000 for the first part and 100 million for the rest, or what. This is where the negotiation starts. That's where you go to the United States and saying, well, this is fantastic. Now let's make sure that we get the biggest bang for every dollar that the United States is going to spend in this. I also want to talk to you about something called the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. So the US has a Caribbean Basin Initiative on which the US in 2022 spent $832 million. But a subset of that is the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative. And if you look at the 2023 budget that was passed, the allocations are somewhere between $74 to $80 billion for security of the Caribbean islands. Initially, the United States looked at its Caribbean border, so looking at Puerto Rico and the other islands that belong to the United States. And they saw this as a very weak border through which basically guns went out and drugs came into the United States. So this initial Caribbean Basin Initiative, security initiative, was to try and seal the porousness of this border. There are 4 entry points in Puerto Rico alone. They had to make sure that they shut all of this down for drugs coming in. But given the commitment to the Caribbean that the United States is making, you can push the periphery to include the Caribbean islands inside the US border. I don't mean that you become states of the United States. Puerto Rico hasn't become DC, still struggling. But I mean from a security perspective, you push the perimeter of the US security umbrella to include these islands. And it will be far more effective even for the United States that you seal off the inflow of drugs and outflow of guns. And in the process, you have partners, 17 countries who can at least work with you, their own experience, their local intelligence. So even the US capacity will be enhanced. But the US is doing something phenomenal with this $80 million, and I want to tell you what they are. If you like, I can send it to you. If you just Google Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, there's a congressional research element. They're doing 5 things with that $80 billion. Number 1, maritime and aerial security cooperation, basically flying and looking at various operations. Number 2, law enforcement capacity building, including assistance to improve law enforcement through police professionalization, anti-corruption, and community-based policing. That's, if they're allocating equally, if I'm not mistaken, there's $16 million available every year for just law enforcement capacity building. If they spread it around, you could get $1 million or $2 million. The third focus is border patrol, border port security, and firearms interdiction. Everything seems to be written with Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad in mind. And then justice sector reform. This is very interesting. The United States government is training judges and prosecutors on how to deal with crime, with especially the escalation of gun and drugs-related crime. And that is phenomenal. There's a small program in the State Department which actually spends about $20 million a year on teaching what is reasonable doubt. And I met judges in Indonesia who told me that that it took a while for the legal systems in Indonesia to institutionalize the concept of reasonable doubt. And they were extremely grateful for the State Department to do that. So we have tremendously talented, motivated lawyers in the State Department who selflessly will work on this idea to improve the capacity. This is also a state capacity. If you do not have effective prosecution, people will get away. Because not only do you have to ensure that the criminal is held accountable, you also have to make sure that you don't compromise your democracy. Otherwise, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And for that, you need to have very well-trained judges and very well-trained prosecutors. And then the fifth initiative under this is crime prevention and at risk for youth. So there is this, if you look at it from an economic perspective, everything that I have talked about so far, whether it is guns or drugs or crime, is about controlling supply. But you need to also have an initiative to control the demand for these things. The demand for guns is instrumental, but the demand for drugs is something very dangerous. It's a reflection of the culture of the society. And I'm not very sure that if you look at it only through the lens of crime, you will be able to address. The vice president in Bahamas talked about how to deal with this issue as a health issue. And that is where the cutting off of the demand comes in, that you invest equally in ensuring in youth training, in building a culture where you say no to drugs. This is very important, and I think that these are the 5 initiatives where capacity building is necessary, and the United States can really play a major role in providing this assistance to you. On the surveillance issue, I'm usually on the other side of this argument. I don't want the state to spy on me. And they might say things to my wife, and then I could get into trouble. But my wife is sitting right there. But I think that, after 9/11, the United States had a paradigm shift. We realized that terrorism, when it happens at this scale, cannot be treated as a crime. We can't wait for the crime to happen and then prosecute it. We had to preempt it. You can't wait for something disastrous to happen and then so it became like a war paradigm. So we were at war against terrorism rather than launching. So I have a feeling for smaller countries where crime has reached this huge level, I think especially with drugs, you have lost the battle if you're prosecuting it after the drugs have been sold. I think in this case you have to preempt the drugs from coming into it's a preemption model, the same model that you use for terrorism, you use this for drugs. You preempt it. There's no point if there is a ton of drugs available on the street if you keep catching people who use it or people who sell it. So that is an important point. I want to tell you that there's some fundamental changes taking place, and this will be my last point, taking place in global structures, especially with the war on Ukraine, with the rise of China. We are seeing that, I hope I'm wrong, and it doesn't happen, but we are entering a new Cold War era with China. But in spite of that, President Biden, who, by the way, lives 11 miles from my house in Delaware. So President Biden argues that while we can have competition with China in geopolitics and technology, but there are issues which are so much more important than just national interest that we need to cooperate. And one of those areas is the environment. So even though these two countries see each other as geopolitical challenges and threats, at least the US is inviting China to be a partner in fighting, because what's the point of having a country if you don't have a planet? And so first we save the planet, and then we'll talk about saving the country. We have transcended some issues. The other one is pandemics. We haven't achieved that great success of cooperation, at least with China, on the pandemic issue. So there are 2 issues already there which are above national interest. And I think that for some countries, transnational crime should also be treated at that level, that it is above national interest. So you work with the US, you work with China. They have great surveillance technology which will prevent. I was reading about Dubai, that even if you wear gloves, even if you shave your entire body, you don't drop any hair, there are no fingerprints, they can still find you through biometrics. They have new advanced cameras, new technology. So I think you should look for new forms of technologies and new capacities to preempt, especially drugs. Because once they come in, I don't think they are going away. So that is a challenge, and I wish you all the best, and I'll be happy to take any questions if you have.
Thank you. There are a couple of microphones being set up on stands. I'll invite you to go to the microphone and address the speaker with your questions. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Ambassador.
You've addressed the...
Excuse me, I would also invite you to just introduce yourself, share your name, so that we
Okay.
can all know who you're speaking.
My name is Manorma Suknandan, and I'm from Suriname. You've addressed the demand side, the supply side, be it guns or be it drugs. What about transshipment? Because many of our countries, and in our case like Suriname, are being used as in between. So the drugs are coming from the south, it goes through the countries, and it ends up in Europe, or mostly now in Europe, and sometimes in the US. From your perspective, because from the academic side, how do you think this should be addressed?
Thank you, Ambassador, for the question. The answer to that lies in state capacity. So, for example, if somebody from the US government was asking this question to me, my answer would be to push it away as far as possible. And what will happen is that if they're not able to transit, then they will sell locally at a lower price. So the challenge for transit countries it's like immigration. People come to Turkey in the hope of going to Europe, but if they cannot go to Europe, they stay in Turkey. And the same will happen with drugs. If someone smuggles drugs into Suriname or Trinidad, and then the United States has built a strong firewall, then they will sell locally, or they will try to find alternative markets. They have only three options: US, Canada, or Europe. So I think the challenge for smaller countries is, I don't know how many countries will look the other way and let it go, thinking it is better that it goes to the US than is sold in our countries. And you will hear from the US if they figure it out. But I think that is going to remain a challenge, and that is why I'm asking for the expansion of the perimeter of the security, which includes, say, so you should negotiate with the US and say, the boundary that you define that you want to seal, the firewall that the US wants to build around the US, includes Suriname in it and not outside it. And I think that is one of the fears. If you cannot push drugs forward, the smugglers may start selling it locally, and it will be devastating to smaller countries. And we have seen this happen in Karachi, for example. Karachi was the port from where Afghanistan's drugs used to be exported, and often when that was sealed, they couldn't go. They started selling, and at one point in the 1990s, late 90s and early 21st century, the data suggested that perhaps 1/10 of Karachi was addicted to drugs. And so that will what can happen potentially for transit states. There is no silver bullet for this issue, but I do realize that that you're both the destination as well as the transit. It's not just that you're a transit state. It's just the cost of the drugs. But the amount of drugs that are being pushed abroad is so huge. It's unbelievable that they feel that they can probably sell both in the transit locations as well as in the final destinations, even though they will make more money in the final destinations.
My name is Pastor Clive Dottin, from the Caribbean Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. I enjoyed your presentation immensely, and to my mind, the signature statement you made is if you intervene after the drugs have been sold, then you have lost the battle. Do you find there's a reluctance to, what I have seen in the small island states and even beyond is that sometimes the mafia owns the rulers, and sometimes the rulers own the mafia. Do you think it's a lack of courage why the godfathers in these small island states are not arrested or convicted? Do you think it's a lack of courage, or because they own the politics, for example, through campaign financing? Thank you so much.
It's a very difficult question that you ask me, sir. Let me also tell you that Trinidad is not democratically a weak country. It is actually in the top 45 or 48 countries on the democracy index, and I was looking at it. In fact, Trinidad is in the same box as the United States, France, and India. Struggling democracies, not yet a full democracy. So, which means that there are some measures that independent prosecutors can take in dealing with this issue. This is where you need very strong journalism to deal with the criminals who are in positions of power. You need investigative journalism. And I would recommend that if there is any NGO or anything that is motivated to combat corruption, this is corruption, you're talking about corruption in the highest places, is, you know, your population is about 1.3 million, and you have 300,000 people in your diaspora in extremely prosperous circumstances in Canada and the United States and Britain. I think an NGO, a journalism investigative project based overseas that targets corruption in high places is probably the best way to deal with this situation, where they are not afraid of corrupt cops visiting them because they asked a question about a former president or a former chief of military staff as to how come he is. Recently, a YouTuber did a simple exercise. He went to a recently retired Indian general's house and just made a video of the Indian Chief of Army Staff's house and put it on video. And it went viral in Pakistan because Pakistani generals are billionaires, whereas Indian generals are not even millionaires. It tells you about the corruption in high places. But if you are sitting in the US or in Canada, you can make these kind of videos, write articles, publish them on the web, and expose this corruption. And there can be a partnership between those who really care about national interests. You see, when the US talks about professionalization of police forces, there is this belief that as a consequence of professionalization, there will be less corruption, as professionalization is an antidote for corruption. I'm not very sure. We have generals who have graduated from US Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who are the most extractive elements and become presidents and dictators in their own countries. So there is this temptation for corruption, and if I could solve the problem of corruption, I would have been flying here on my own personal jet and not traveling commercial on American Airlines. But it is a challenge, no doubt. And there has to be a bottom-up movement from civil society, from NGOs, etc., that continuously push back and demand accountability of those who are in power and those who are potentially providing protection to that. You need to also have transparency on how money flows into politics. And that is where you have to make sure that known gangsters are not buying cars or houses for your next senator. So that is a challenge, a transparency on earnings when you run for office. I do a lot of shows in South Asia, and since the new Pakistani general came up, who has actually memorized the Quran, I've been demanding that he tell us what his net worth is today, so that I know when he retires in 3 years how much money he stole from his country. Because he's going to be a billionaire in 2 years' time from being nothing. So we have to have this movement, civil society-based movement, and even from international. I think this is also another arena where the United States can play a role in tracking. The US has already the infrastructure for tracking money that comes from drugs and terrorism-related finances. So we have instruments in place which can track money. So if there is an honest commander of police in your country, they can request the US to say, can you tell us where the money is going? Where are these rich people, these former people in positions of power? Where are they hiding their money? And make a public demand that it be restored back to the country and people be held accountable. I hope that provides some.
Richard Kelshaw. I suppose I should say Rear Admiral Kelshaw, but those were from a different life. I want to thank you, Professor, for that extremely thought-provoking contribution. I can safely say, because my wife is present, that I would love to spend more time with you. There are so many areas that you've covered that it's difficult to choose. But I would like your views on the fact that 10 or 15 years ago, Trinidad and Tobago signed an agreement with the US called the Ship Rider Agreement. That empowered United States Coast Guard vessels to patrol our waters in conjunction with our vessels. And while that took place, Britain withdrew its naval forces from the Caribbean for economic reasons. Then you had 9/11 and you withdrew your forces from the Caribbean to protect America. There is no doubt that after that happened, we see this tremendous increase in crime and trafficking and reaching the stage where we're at now. The fact that America gives money cannot help us with presence or being proactive. And what are your views on having the Ship Rider Agreement reinstalled so that America is actually assisting us in a very tangible way?
So so if you're working with an interest group in the United States, like sometimes I talk to Indian interest groups, and they say, India needs this. It's not going to work. So Americans will say, yeah, good. I know others also who need that. But if you can make a compelling argument that we need this and this is in your interest, if you can make that compelling argument that your needs kind of align with US interests, then you are more likely to get the point. The United States has failed miserably when it comes to guns going out of the US and drugs coming in, even at home and even abroad. This is a problem that even Mexico has. This is a problem across the entire Latin America. The guns from the United States are going abroad, and so gun violence is so prominent. But I think there are clear understanding in the United States that, so for example, you tie it to immigration. If there is less gun violence in the South, less drugs-related, crime-related dysfunctionality in these countries, then there will be less migration north. So there you have to tie it to some national interest, then it flies much faster through the Senate and the Congress, and you can get these allocations. Sometimes allocations are there, but they are directed elsewhere. So you have to keep track of it. So a little bit of a knowledge about how the United States thinks about security in this region, and then basically, with the people from US Embassy sitting here, I shouldn't be saying this, but basically you have to outsmart the US administration and try to use them to serve your interests. You should take lessons from Zelensky. He's become a master at this. Now he's getting F-16s after Biden said no to F-16s just a few months ago. So you have to make sure that you have convinced that your interests are aligned. But I also think that there is a need for capacity building at your level too, at your state level. That I think many states which are in close relations with the United States tend to become free riders, expecting the United States to fund all their security needs and other needs. And to give you a small example, I was in Finland. They have this 5-year national security plan, and I was there when the previous one was being articulated, and I found that they had a depression crisis in Finland. And the US was sending psychiatrists to deal with it. And I was quite surprised. I mean, it was a great thing. I was happy that my country was so wonderful, but I was also wondering, how does this money get allocated that we are taking care of Finland's citizens? They were at that time not even a member of NATO. So I think there is a lot of money that the US does spend for good. The US does a tremendously bad job of talking about the wonderful things that we do using our foreign aid, etc. But I think that if you are able to find a voice in the State Department or even in the Department of Defense who will listen to you, I have a feeling that there is already money to do what you're asking to do. Already there is that money. They just have to understand that, oh, this is like, it might be priority 4, they need to make it priority 2, and then that things happen. Right now, when we look at the numbers of your crime-related numbers, compared to the US, they look so small that we don't feel that urgency in the US that you feel here, because you're a small country. We're not looking at your population every time you say, okay, they have 500 murders. That's a very small number. Probably there are many cities in the US which will beat you any day on those crime numbers. So I have a feeling that you have to, the smarter a country's understanding of US foreign policy and deeper its engagement with the US, the greater their likelihood of benefiting from the US as a partner. I hope that helps. We can talk about other things over lunch.
All right, thank you very much.